Welcome back to our final panel of the day before we have the concluding armchair with Brazil. So this afternoon we've looked at tools, narratives, and systems that shape how climate information circulates. Now we're going to look at the bigger picture of accountability and democratic resilience, drawing and building upon those discussions that we had yesterday. So this session asks, what kinds of policies, coalitions, and civic efforts can shift the conditions that allow misinformation to spread in the first place? We'll hear about strategies that range from the legislative and the regulatory to community-based and youth-led organizations, all aimed at protecting the information spaces that we rely upon. So we have a great leader for this session to launch us off. It's Michael Khoo, who you've heard from yesterday. He's the co-founder of UpShift Strategies and also the co-chair of Climate Action Against Disinformation, which has been a key coalition partner for us in preparing this summit. So Michael, look forward to your comments.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer, and for this conference. It has really been inspiring both for me and for other people who have been in this space, just to see this amount of community and this many broad ideas of how many people are coming to this issue. I'm going to talk about policy in my section here for about 10 minutes. And if there's any one thing I want to leave people with is that, as we talk about technology policy, how to regulate the information environment, the other side says it's hard. And I'm here to say that solving climate change is hard. Comparatively, solving climate disinformation is a walk in the park. We've done this 1,000 times before on 1,000 different issues, and we can do it again. There's a three-part strategy that the other side uses to say that either it's too hard, or it's too expensive, or we shouldn't do it anyway. They say it's hard, and this is by the people who promised to put us on Mars, people who promise AGI by the end of the year. They say it's too expensive. This is from people who are literally the richest people in the world or have $250 million yachts. It's a con, it's a trick. This is not hard. We regulate things. We've done this for our whole lives. Humans created this problem. Humans can fix this problem. And it's not a physical problem we're trying to fix, like getting carbon, sucking it back out of the atmosphere and somehow storing it underground. So let's talk about what are we asking for when you look about policy options on climate disinformation. And it's really the same thing that we ask out of any other industry: safety, transparency, and accountability. I'm going to give 3 examples that I like to pick on: pork, pills, and planes. These are things that we have regulated through different eras of our history and regulated very well. You start with historically planes, which in the 1950s, when they tried to commercialize the idea of people jumping in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, people were understandably scared. So they built the industry based on transparency of safety. Transparency to the extent that when the very worst thing happens to a plane, it goes down, you get this thing that for some reason it's called a black box, is nothing but it's actually a transparency tool that is shared not only with the government, but with every other company in the industry. That's how they built their safety standards. That's how they built trust. That's how they built an industry, was on the transparency that guaranteed the safety. And that was on an emerging technology too, so that's helpful to think through. Next one is you think about through the food scares of the 80s and 90s, and that developed the HACCP system so that we can do traceability in your pork or your hamburgers of E. coli to salmonella. Very complex system, but lo and behold, business is complex, and they can figure this out in order to ensure that people don't die from eating the hamburger, and they did. I may not like McDonald's hamburgers, but they don't kill you as much as they used to. Or not in the same way. And then last is the obvious example of pills. Can you imagine if the popular product, Ozempic, ended up causing a massive suicide psychosis? It'd be pulled off the shelf in weeks, and think of the settlements that the companies would pay out. So they get, through these industries, we see complex industries, new technologies, they all get the same basic things. They get a promise of safety, they get accountability, and they do it through transparency. This can be done in this industry with a flick of a switch. And if you think back to like this, I don't know if people know what Nielsen ratings are. They were how we used to rate like which media property had more viewers. That was like an audited process. It took a while. Paper had to change hands, etc. Now, the transparency you want on who is where online is literally has a marginal cost of zero because all these systems are here. Yet we're in this new environment where all of a sudden the not so perfect transparency we had 2 to 3 years ago has now turned into a black hole because they've shut down, Facebook has shut down CrowdTangle, the tool by which we saw that the right wing was getting more amplification than progressives. Twitter shut down the API, shutting down almost all access. And so they've turned things dark when there's no cost to this transparency. So the attack is on actually information itself. And so we've met with a lot of the tech platforms over the years in our coalition. And the playbook that they use to say why they can't do things is sort of 5 irritating stages. First, they say it's not happening. So we do this report and we say there's a bunch of hate speech or climate disinformation. They say it's not happening. We do it again. We show it again. They're like, oh, it's less than you think it is. And you're being hysterical and too emotional about it. And then the third stage, they say, oh, that's supposed harm, doesn't matter anyway. Everyone's got a racist uncle. And then next, they say, oh, we can't fix it. It's too complex. We've just made such a complex ecosystem. We just don't know what's even going on. And then last, they actually get to the on their knees and they say, stop bullying us. You know, those murderous leftists, as Musk says, or Mark Andreessen getting on this long thing about innovation or regulation has squashed innovation in America on tech. A country has not passed a tech law in 20 years, not a single one. So these are the steps that they just use to bully people. And the last one was in our, I think, 3rd dozen meetings with Facebook, they brought a bunch of us into a room and asked us to help them with their hard content moderation problems. So they put up a picture on the screen of an Instagram shot of a trans person exposing their nipple. They said, well, what do we do about that? That's the hard case. You tell us where we should draw the lines. And to our credit, all of us just got up and walked out and said, well, that's why you get paid $400,000 a year is to figure this out. This is the price of global domination. Content moderation is something that you have done and that you can do and that you will do. So to think about the content moderation, just to the point of that, it is simple. It's simple in that you and I don't need to be figuring out every detail of this. They've been able to do it, and we have hard examples of how they have done it. They're now just in a, oh my gosh, it's too expensive while they're hitting record profits moment. But if you think about all of the examples, so when we first started working with the companies, we got from 2020 to 2023, we got climate change disinformation policies from all the big tech platforms. So from Facebook, we got one, Google, Twitter, 2 policies out of Twitter, TikTok and Pinterest. Facebook spent more than $10 million building the Climate Science Information Center in advance of the COP in Glasgow. And we worked with them. We knew they had daily meetings with their team, that they pulled together this site to, quote, outcompete the bad information with good, which was ill thought through. And we later proved that their $10 million machine got outcompeted by the disinformers by a factor of 12 to 1. But they were trying it. The point is they can do these large things internally. They're a large company. And then Twitter, which is another hilarious example in hindsight, I guess, they came to us in advance of Earth Day and wanted to get one up on the other companies who had all been doing policies, because this is how shallow they think. And so they said, well, what if we were to do, a Twitter space? And Twitter spaces, if you don't know, are like these areas, a topic area. And we said, well, look, if you made a climate space that was safe for climate science, we would endorse it. And they said, well, what would that take? And we're like, well, why don't we put Catherine Cahill and every IPC scientist on this list and put Desmog Blog's list of climate deniers on the do not have list. And if you did that, we would endorse it. And lo and behold, they did. It got traffic. It grew. It was a successful product, and they chose not to talk about it. I think it's still up yet because they don't have enough staff to take it down. And then we had policies with TikTok, Pinterest, Google's, and they're all, you can complain about the lack of enforcement of all of them, but the point is that it was very straightforward business behavior in order to comply with what are sort of pretty natural regulatory demands that we would all have of, again, back to the safety, transparency, and accountability. I want to take a little pause of the one other very important argument that we're all facing or going to face, and that plays into the complexity, which is the free speech argument that the other side says. They say freedom of speech. We generally, and especially in the context of the UN Climate Change Initiative, talk about freedom of expression, which is a broader concept. And when you see what they have done with their free speech, I would say that in America, there really is no such thing as a libertarian anymore. All of them are actually just fascists who are finally uncovered, come out of their hoodies, and you see what they're doing with all of their power. So you look at the first few things that they did, Musk's lawsuits. The first one that got turned down, Justice Breyer said something like, in some cases, it's hard to figure out what people are doing. In this case, it's quite simple. The plaintiff is trying to squash the defendant's speech with his speech, an abuse of a legal system. So that got thrown out. And of course, he went judge shopping to Texas for the continuation of it. But so that's the abuse of the legal system. You have the abuse of ownership that's happening. So from Jeff Bezos censoring the editorial pages of the Post to the right-wing ownership of 90% of the podcast universe is owned by right-wing outlets now in the States, to the buying of Twitter, and now, final straw, buying TikTok, right? So the entire, and Zuckerberg going back to his bro roots is part of that too, right? So there's nothing that is owned. So there's abuse of the legal system, abuse of the ownership, and then there's last, the abuse of the government. So they start this committee about the weaponization of government and then proceed to literally do exactly that. Try not to say Orwellian every day in our lives, but and that's FTC investigations of NGOs. It's FCC threatening licensing that leads to Jimmy Kimmel. It's GOP members saying anyone who disagrees about Charlie Kirk is going to have their driver's license and business license taken away. I mean, this is to say that our side gets so obsessed with how do we stay on the right side of freedom of speech? How do we not cross that line? Their side is not having that conversation. It's bringing a knife to a gunfight, or it's us playing checkers and they're playing total world chaos. So I think the less time we spend, I think we have to be intellectually, sound about what we think about our freedom of speech values, but I think we already have that. We have a lot of UN history that comes into the freedom of expression, and we have a broader concept, thankfully, in Canada than we do in the United States about what the limits of harm to others entails. But getting caught up in a long conversation of freedom of speech is their trick. One of the 5 or 6 tricks I'm trying to outline here. So last, I'll end by just going over, that all sounds fairly hopeless, especially in the States. Sometimes it is hard to wake up, and it's very nice to be back in Canada, where I'm originally from. But there is a real movement on our side. And, to quote Phil from yesterday, the only reason they need propaganda is because our side would win. The only reason they need lawfare is because we were winning. The brand that we had established for people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and tech in general is like record lows. They are disliked because of the things they've done. So they have to do all these things. But we are winning, and you can see it on every metric, from public polling to the World Economic Forum to across the globe. And this is the policy part of it, is that there are policies from the European Digital Services Act to Brazil passing its child safety law and other content moderation laws, to Japan, Australia, to Canada. So there is a movement, even if it's going to be absent and backsliding in the States. They know we're winning. And as Scott said earlier today, you talk to any cab driver or anyone here who's a parent who has a kid who might be getting a device or has one, everybody cares about this. It's our job to tap into that universal goal and desire people have for fairness. Because if we think about things about fairness, we get away from content moderation regulation, and everybody wants fairness. Animals in the wild see unfairness and they react to it. So if we stick to those values, that's all this is about an abuse of power of one group to have power over the others. And I think all of our regulations, you go back to the boring terms of safety, accountability, and transparency, those are to ensure a level playing field and fairness. We can do it. We should do it. We have it. We will.
was powerful and provocative. So I'm sure that there may be some comments and questions for Michael. Carol.
Oh. How? How?
Hello, Internet. The question was how?
How? Well, and I think like that's why I used the example of like how we said how in 1950 when the airline industry like had to develop a complex system. We actually, and then later we actually did develop these systems. So one of the best examples of how they actually did prevent great harm was leading into January 6th. So there was a big report that was done by about the January 6th committee, you probably all saw. Well, there was a sub-report about the role of social media companies that unfortunately was struck from the report, but it's available and people wrote it up. And that looked at all the measures that Facebook took in order to not have the election itself overturned. And they call it the break glass policy, but it's a policy. It's a business just doing stuff it has to do in order to have a safe product. And they absolutely turned every screw and controlled their platform in a way to prevent the Stop the Steal movement from overturning the election. What they did 2 days later was turn everything off. And over the course of 2 months, that led to January 6th. And they saw every step of it happening. And the few people with conscience working there were like, by the way, we should stop this. So to say that we don't know like how to do it, I mean, it's actually been done specifically in this industry, and we have every right to expect it through every other part of our industry. Sure, we need political will is probably the only how that I'd really worry about.
I think just a hot pursuit on that is, you raise a compelling case that the tech companies need to be taken on. That was a big part of your conversation. We have even fewer levers in Canada than you have in the United States. So just wondering, speaking to Canadians, should we be still trying to influence these big tech companies over which we have fewer and fewer levers, or should we be aiming more for digital sovereignty and trying to create Canadian info ecosystems, or is that also would provoke a provocative how question?
Well, I think, I mean, it's good for every country to develop its own tech stack for sure. And I think that the movements that people like Tyler Owens have started to have the conversation about digital sovereignty. I think every country has had a concept of sovereignty, which makes all the sense in the world. But like, as far as working directly on those tech companies, like Phil and I don't meet with them anymore. We're like, there's no point to either of us talking to them. So we're not working directly on them in that same way as much as we are for the broader regulation. Yeah, I think that every country, Brazil shows a way that, they shut down Twitter for a while for its violation of terms of it just can be done. These are switches literally that get flipped. And we want them flipped in the right way, not the way that authoritarians use them, in whichever far away or very close by country.
Yeah, I'd like you to build a bit on this and the analogy with other industries. My feeling is that both Bolsonaro and Lula would agree that we don't want people to crash in airplanes. They would totally disagree on how do we regulate and how we tackle disinformation. And when we were having all these debates in the US, when we were seeing that both sides of the House, the Democrats saying, well, you don't do enough. And the Republicans saying, you are censoring our conservative voices. Do you feel that at some point in history, maybe not in the coming 2 years, but at some point we can have this sort of bipartisan agreement and consensus? And I think that you were referring to the kids, to the the children's safety bill in Brazil. I think that this is where we can have some sort of bipartisan support. Everyone wants kids to be safe. But do you think we can get to that point where we have a broader consensus?
Well, I'd say first, comparing Lula to Bolsonaro and what they say is not a helpful thing to do because one side is arguing in bad faith. And that's like what you've just seen right now happen by the party of free speech, taking away people's driver's licenses for having a disagreement online. So whether or not you can have a consensus with them seems unlikely because they're not arguing in good faith. What I'm saying is that we stick to the deep values that are everyone's values to say fairness and safety, and people believe that. So that gets to your point about child safety. That is certainly everybody's first law they go for, but I really think it's a mistake to say you're going to do that primarily first, because there's a whole bunch of different considerations for children, and we're actually concerned about the broader part of society. And the children's one also just has more restrictions that you're allowed to put on. I think that we can do this, and we have done it already, right? So do it in the way that we were exactly doing it pre-January 6, right? Like those measures to be codified, which other countries have done, and we can do. So whether or not we get consensus in the United States, most likely not.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. It's been a great provocative discussion, and I think you brought together some interesting ideas. And I want to also thank you, because I know you have a plane to catch, for your advice as we were putting together this program with the Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition. Thank you. So we have talked several times through yesterday and today about ads and about bias in ads, and so it's my pleasure to continue that conversation on a practical level with Aditi Ramesh from Check My Ads, who's also going to be talking about all other ways of legislative advocacy, including drawing upon the CMA's work. Aditi.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Aditi. I'm a policy manager with Check My Ads. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the digital advertising industry and why we're so concerned with its regulation, especially as to ways that it impacts our climate discourse. A little bit about what Check My Ads does and kind of our approach to this work, and then I'll get into our policy platform, which we just put out this year, which has specific interventions that we've introduced at the state level in the US. So digital advertising is the business model of information. Digital advertising is bought and sold through a very complex supply chain. On one end is advertisers, so think a small business in your neighborhood that wants to advertise their business, and on the other hand is a publisher, or maybe the local newspaper on which the ad will be placed. And in between these two parties are a number of intermediaries, which I will get into a little bit later. In 2025, the global digital advertising market will be valued at $1 trillion in ads from brands. And then on top of that, each of these intermediary companies gets a lot of access to our personal data and intimate details about what we're watching, what we're seeing, what we're consuming, things like that. And at Check My Ads, we're working on a series of policy explainers to help folks digest how the ad tech ecosystem impacts a number of issues. Advertisers really can't verify where their ads are ending up, and so they end up funding climate misinformation even when they don't want to be. And we also talk a lot about how it defunds reliable journalism. So for every $2.16 of ad spent that's meant to be sent to legitimate publishers, $1 of that is sent to misinformation. And so because advertisers can't track where their ads are ending up, their ads are often shown in far less savory places than what was promised to them. And the other thing we talk about is how advertisers are losing too, because especially small businesses that are now so reliant on this complex supply chain of programmatic advertising, they have really limited visibility and are kind of forced into using these services that they don't fully understand or really have much consent into where their ads are being placed. So I want to talk about what this supply chain that I've mentioned actually looks like. And this is what we refer to as programmatic advertising. Like I mentioned earlier, there are two parties you usually think about, the publisher and the advertiser. But in reality, there are a whole host of companies that are in the middle. And so one companies or services. So one of those services is the ad exchange, which is the digital technology platform where publishers sell their ad space to advertisers using real-time bidding strategies to determine the price of that ad space. There are also ad verification companies that are supposed to confirm that ad placements on publishers adhere to those brand standards. And so I won't get into all of these, but what we're primarily concerned with is the fact that there are companies that own multiple sides of the marketplace. So the same company that's working with a website to get an ad place is maybe the same company that's working with the brand. And that's why we are really concerned about stronger competition laws, which is what I'll get to a little bit later in the presentation. So how does digital advertising impact our climate and our climate information integrity? So digital advertising fuels the monetization of climate disinformation. Oil and gas interests are funding the constant distribution of climate disinformation. And this happens through greenwashing and ad content, and through a sprawling network of online publishers who produce an enormous amount of anti-climate change propaganda to really undermine the action that we need around climate. And by helping to monetize this content, ad exchanges play a major hand in helping disinformation flourish. At the same time, AI technologies are now fueling climate disinformation at scale. And so now a lot of programmatic tools are automated through AI systems, and we have even less visibility into how these tools are working because AI-driven systems are prioritizing ad slots on websites and apps with the highest likelihood and volume of engagement. And it makes it harder for smaller publishers with lower amounts of site traffic to compete. And lastly, data centers are the physical infrastructure that support digital advertising. Digital advertising relies on data centers for everything from ad delivery to analytics. And some estimate that digital advertising accounts for over 1% of global energy consumption, similar to the airline industry. So at Check My Ads, the work that we have cut out for ourselves is to stop the flow of billions of dollars stolen from advertisers and publishers going to fund harmful content online. It's to rebalance the power dynamic between advertisers, publishers, and ad tech intermediaries. We need to change the incentive for monetizing the intimate details of citizens' lives, and we need to end self-dealing, inflated prices, and other unfair practices by addressing anti-competitive behavior. And so this requires, and we've really taken a multi-pronged approach to this problem. And so at Check My Ads, we try to shine a light on really what's happening in the industry. So we do a lot of research and reporting. We do supply chain investigations. So we're actually running campaigns sometimes on these platforms. Recently, we ran a campaign on Google's Performance Max, their new AI-driven platform, and we're going to publish some results from that study soon. And we use some of that research to drive transparency. So engaging in government consultations, championing advertisers to know, right to know and advocate for transparency, and creating resources and training for industry practitioners. And lastly, we build long-term structural reform needed that I alluded to a little bit earlier. So that includes policy, coalition building through partnerships with civil society organizations, and advancing regulatory solutions across the globe, and also engaging in consultations. So earlier this year, we put out a policy platform with specific solutions for digital advertising. We introduced legislation in the state of Vermont called the Building Better Online Businesses Act, which incorporates some of these specific policy fixes. So the first one I'll get into is limits on common ownership and anti-competitive behavior. Some of the biggest players in ad tech operate across both sides of the marketplace, like I mentioned earlier, buying and selling and brokering ads with the same corporate structure. When one company controls multiple layers of the transaction, it can steer business towards its holding, obscure pricing, manipulate outcomes in ways that no single stakeholder can detect. And these conflicts of interest not only entrench their monopoly power, but they don't allow smaller competitors to enter the market, leading to also an accumulation of data by these companies. So we advocate for structural separation. We believe that any company earning over $250 million and annually in ad revenue should not be allowed to own both the buy side and the sell side of an exchange. And we also support promoting competition in the digital advertising industry at large. And we've seen a number of countries take up this issue over the last year itself, against Google in particular, because Google owns a majority of the market. So the US, EU, India, Australia, Japan, Turkey have all filed lawsuits against Google for their anti-competitive practices in the ad market. And just in the last 2 weeks alone, 3 smaller advertising technology companies have filed a lawsuit against Google. So folks, I think, are really starting to understand the harmful practices and the monopolization of this industry. And in just 2 days, the Google ad tech search trial filed by the Department of Justice in the US is going to go into their remedies phase. And our COO, Ariel Garcia, is going to be there reporting live from the trial. So if you're interested in following updates from that trial, they'll all be posted at us.googleads.com. So you can follow them on that website. Another policy solution that we advocate for is establishing a duty of care for ad tech brokers. Ad tech brokers have no obligation to act in the best interests of their clients. So we propose codifying a best interest duty for all ad tech intermediaries and verification vendors. So these entities must use reasonable diligence, care, skill to serve their clients. And this is a solution I mentioned yesterday, so driving more transparency in the supply chain, understanding if ad tech intermediaries are working with data brokers, who they are working with, are they working with a website that's spouting climate disinformation? So advertisers really have a right to know who the intermediaries are in the supply chain. And this would include a disclosure of their legal identity, where they're incorporated, things like that. And then we also advocate for more transparency, specifically at the URL level and log level, which is like the specific site placement of where their ads are going and whether they're on disinformation sites. And the last one is privacy respecting advertising practices. Like advertisers really, or the ad exchanges really don't need to know every intimate detail about people's lives. And so we advocate for data minimization and protections around sensitive data as well. And we are happy to do like consultations on our policy platform and have been working with a number of different markets and kind of brainstorming ways to move some of these solutions forward. So thank you.
Well, congratulations for the wonderful work and for the great slogan, find, fix, forge. That's great, nice and punchy too. Are there some questions or comments?
The data that they also own and sell. You alluded to it in one of your slides. Is there any ballpark figure of what the value of that might be?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but I could probably get you a number at some point. Yeah.
I'm sure it's substantial.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You can pass next door too.
Hi, I was wondering if you could also maybe expand a little bit on, there was a note in there saying changing the incentive to, what was it, like against the panopticon of horrors that we have to serve us ads or whatever, just talking about taking up all that information and all that. You're saying something about changing the incentives. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Yeah. Was it in reference to like privacy or?
Yeah, I was wondering if you're like basically promoting an idea of like an alternative way to fund the internet. Is that where that's going? I'm trying to figure out. Well, I just want you to expand a little more on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Essentially, trying to rebalance the current market is what we're advocating for. So like right now, a lot of the funding of misinformation and the hoarding of personal data is largely because we don't have visibility into what these companies are doing or how they're accumulating so much data. And so we're trying to build more transparency and like naturally hoping that the market will rebalance itself if there are more players, if there are more folks that are, if there are more choices for advertisers. We're hoping that the idea is that some of the the harms that I mentioned will fix itself, essentially, the incentive structure.
Just if there's more competition, does that not make it more of an incentive to collect more of our data?
Which is also why we are advocating for stronger privacy laws.
Okay. Thanks.
Over there.
I think your work is really cool. And I was just wondering, I'm concerned about the due diligence points on serving your advertisers properly, because I work in the sustainable finance space and it really reminds me of the concept of fiduciary duty. And I get that thrown in my face. I like all the time is like, we can't move away from fossil fuels because of our fiduciary duty. So I just feel like that's going to come back to you. Like it's well intentioned to serve your advertisers, right? But it feels like it's something that will just get bent down the line against you. What do you think? Have you thought about that?
I haven't thought about that in particular, and that policy proposal was put forth by our COO. But I'd love to talk more about it and how you've kind of seen that come up in your own work, and maybe think about ways that we would also be blocked by that in the future. I think a lot of our policy solutions are informed by regulation in the financial markets, like thinking about it being a marketplace. So I'd love to talk about it more.
Conscious ad network study,
Yeah.
where they cut out the bottom feeders and it made a much more efficient ad buy, but they draw lines.
No, do you want to?
Just there's another group in our coalition that works closely with them called Conscious Ad Network out of the UK. And they, along with some ad partner, did a study to show if you take out the 80% of your inventory and stay with the top, like more known brands, it became much more efficient ROI. So it really is like that money is stolen, Aditi's language, right? Just is going nowhere, no one knows where it's going. So the fiduciary responsibility is that you should actually get to know where your ads are actually going. And instead of it going to organized crime, which we note is the second largest source of organized crime's money in the world, is online advertising now, according to the World Federation of Advertisers.
Yeah.
$1 billion gets unmonitored.
We have a question online. I'm going to quickly go to the question online at this point. So do you want to read that out? Sarah? Yes.
So we have two questions online. One from Nicolas. He says, would you be able to discuss the process you went through to get to the law passed in Vermont? And another one that is anonymous says, have you seen any other specific barriers to entry for ad brokers besides the ones you mentioned, data, Google being a monopoly?
So the first question, speaking to the legislation we introduced in Vermont, and it wasn't actually passed into law. It was stalled in the session, and then the session ended. So we're hoping to do more state level work, but the process for that essentially was we built out our policy platform and we drafted specific policy language, and we worked with lawmakers in Vermont who were interested in taking up this issue, and we did a series of consultations with them over the course of, I think, late last year, and hoping to do something similar in other states as well. And the barriers to entry, I think really what we're hearing from advertisers is that because some of the biggest online ad exchange marketplaces right now are Google, are Meta, and they have such a monopoly, like a control over the data, they're just not able to compete because so much of the ad inventory is dominated by these companies, and they actually have there are specific projects that Google has actually taken up to push competitors out. And you can read more about this on our US versus Google site, but this was actually a lot of this information was in the trial and how they're really directly kind of going after competitors and trying to push them out of the market.
Well, thank you very much, Noemi, and again, thanking Aditi for the presentation. So this session is not only about accountability, it's also about democracy. And yesterday we talked about democracy from the local level all the way to the global level. And this morning we also talked about multi-stakeholder coalitions. And what would all that be without youth? And so we do have Gareth Gransaull from the Executive Director of Regeneration to focus some of the comments on that very important dimension of coalition building.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's so great to be here with you. I will be looking at my phone a little bit, so I apologize for that. But thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. My name is Gareth. I run Regeneration, which is a youth advocacy organization that's really at the intersection of movement building and storytelling, with really an explicit mission to combat the political and cultural power of the fossil fuel industry, and in particular, their relationships to right-wing movements in Canada. And our kind of central belief as an organization is that a big reason why climate change action has failed so far is that we've failed to understand how narrative and story is a way that shapes societies much more powerfully than truth and rationality. And we really also started as a network of business students across the country trying to transform capitalism. So in terms of trying to undermine the basic myths and core beliefs that form the basis of an exploitative economy, so neoliberalism, neocolonialism, et cetera. And so where our name came from, also, I think this slide went a bit too far ahead, but anyway, our name as Regeneration is that we're a youth movement that wants to center regenerative values, and also, you know, symbolize that we're the generation that will be the ones to make that happen and to really implement systems change as like the future of sustainability. But our flagship initiative is the Rework Your Future campaign, which has been ongoing for the last year, which is really to mobilize the labor of young people in particular to accelerate the transition to a clean economy. And we do that by trying to get young people excited about careers in climate action, and also to not work for companies that we call fossil fuel enablers. And so a big part of this work is also, we have a 6-part documentary series that you can see on our website that highlights a lot of really amazing organizations that are making a difference in all of these sectors of the clean economy, which includes clean energy, sustainable mobility, food systems, et cetera, and examples of what careers in those sectors look like. We also have a job board on our website that has over 20,000 users where people can go and find opportunities. But the other side of this work is the negative stuff. So trying to get people not to work for not to work for the companies that we call fossil fuel enablers. And so part of the work that we do is mapping out what that actually is and looks like. And we've tried to create this large database of information related to this framework that was developed, I think, by friends at the Emil Foundation, or that have created this megaphone diagram that shows essentially how various stages of support for the fossil fuel industry get their message out to wider and wider segments of the public. And we're sort of looking at how there are particular organizations that we don't want our stakeholders to work for, but we also want to shine a light on what is the actual work that they do. And I also just want to shout out Amelia in the room, because we have an upcoming report coming out very soon about highlighting conflicts of interest among lobbying firms, which are a major actor that both represents health groups, but also lobbies for climate, lobbies for fossil fuel companies. But what I wanted to highlight today is a bit of a topic shift, which is that I think, when these conversations about polarization in society and the decline of democracy center around disinformation, they tend to forget that there's also two deeper and in a way antecedent causes of polarization that also can be accelerated by disinformation, which are a distrust of elites and conflicts over values. And so the point of highlighting this is that polarization is not just a technological problem. And there are things like the distrust of elites that have a lot more to do with narrative and story than they have to do with this idea of what is this binary of true versus false. And so I want to show everybody this useful framework that we use to think about our work, which is from the Narrative Institute, which is about how stories are sort of the instances that we hear in the news that shape our, understanding on a sort of superficial level. Narratives are then collections of stories that then inform how we understand the world. And then myths and worldviews are based on collections of narratives that are often instinctive and unspoken, but that are really that are things that shape the way that we understand the world. And I think what's going on in Canada right now is that climate action at large is being scapegoated because of the fact that there's a narrative gap in progressive communications that's met with this pre-existing sort of populist sentiment and anger at the status quo. And when we don't have communication to talk about the root causes of things like the affordability crisis caused by, for example, fossil fuel related inflation costing $12,000 for the average Canadian household, when that's not common sense for people, it becomes very easy to sort of insert your own reactionary agenda to not only just get rid of the carbon tax, but define the entire project of climate mitigation as a kind of elitist, technocratic, or woke project. And this is a really big shame, because there is actually a lot of overlap between the sentiments of our movement and the feelings of the general public, in the sense that people feel that market, big tech and big corporations have too much power, the system is rigged, etc. We understand that there are limits to market-based solutions, that the fossil fuel industry has too much power. And in this current era, their politics is really defined by this contestation of who is elite. And it's either that it's the CEOs and corporations, or it's the woke left government bureaucrats and their allies in the media. And we are really losing this discursive battle. But the thing about that is that this is not new. This has been going on for a very long time. In 1979, cultural theorist Stuart Hall wrote an article called The Great Moving Right Show, which is where he defined his opinion that politics over the ensuing decades would be defined by right-wing operatives pushing the Overton window further and further to the right, such that ideas that are now considered normal would have at the time been considered crazy. And he was the one that also defined the term authoritarian populism, being the system by which right-wing forces use culture war techniques to solidify this system of oligarchy and corporate control. And this also relates to this diagram, which some of you might have seen, which is the fishhook theory, which is that the further that we push politics to the right, then the center gets more and more right over time, and then things become normalized in that way. And the reality is that right-wing movements have been extremely effective at mobilizing narrative to push and mold and shape public opinion. And they actually have a two-track strategy for doing that. And there's a way that, the Koch brothers literally have a document that's called The Structures of Social Change that was written in like the 80s, where they talk about how they bisect their messaging from messaging that's driven towards elites, which happens through think tanks and public policy forums and op-eds, and then messaging that's aimed at the general public. And what's happened with the internet is that this system has just gone into overdrive. And in Canada, you can see actually how this constellation of actors has organized itself. And this is a public diagram that's available online from DSMOG, which if you just look up the Canada Proud Network, you can see the constellation of actors in Canada that are playing this role of amplifying right-wing opinions and molding and shaping the public discourse in a way that's very dangerous. And you can also see the central coordinating role played by organizations like the Canada Strong and Free Network, which is right here, as well as the work of these coordinated social media pages that are all run by this organization that is called Mobilized Media, that has had an outsized influence on Canadian politics, including by, for example, playing a major role in getting Doug Ford elected. And I also want to highlight some recent headlines from the news that show how the extreme far right is shaping Canadian politics in a way that's shifting us farther and farther to the type of politics that's happening in America. We're literally watching the Overton window being shifted in real time. So, for example, you have a group like Take Back Alberta, that is a rural Christian nationalist group in Alberta that has virtually control of the governing board of the UCP that has power in that province. And they just passed a resolution recently to recognize CO2 as a nutrient instead of a pollutant. Or there's groups like, there's a Christian fundamentalist group called Liberty Canada Coalition that's raising millions of dollars to run Christian nationalist candidates across the country. And they have a lot of money from the so-called gender critical movement that's coming out of the United States that is very transphobic and homophobic. But then you also have organizations like, there's the Civitas Society, that is a secret society that is, deeply embedded with the Conservative Party of Canada. And they have platformed organizers such as from the Save Canada movement that are trying to pass anti-trans legislation all across the country. And they have this sort of meeting that they have every year where they platform their most prominent grassroots organizers with major partners of strategy consulting firms. And so anyway, so there's this, what I'm trying to showcase is that there's this coordinated way that people push the Overton window and they put pressure on right-wing parties such as the People's Party of Canada, which then pull the Conservatives in their direction. And then you get something like Mark Carney basically governing like a conservative, because that's how far the conversation has shifted. And the other thing that we really have to talk about is that the root of right-wing politics in this country is what Shane Gunster calls extractive populism, which is this core narrative that fossil fuels equal economic growth, which equals nation building. And you see this with everything that's going on with the Bill C5 and the new pipelines and what have you. And this all is also centered around this concept of symbolic nationalization, which is this idea that the fossil fuel industry is an industry that's run in the public interest as if it was publicly owned. Whereas what our job to do as communicators is not just only fight disinformation. We also need to reframe the way that people understand this basic equation, and we can do that with a narrative frame of fairness. So people don't hate corporations. What they hate is the feeling of unfairness. And in reality, in this country, the fossil fuel industry is primarily foreign owned, and it's a system where the profits are largely privatized and the costs and the risks are socialized and imposed on workers and regular people. And so this is my way of doing a sort of pitch for this film that we have coming out next year, which is a really exciting project we've been working on for a while, which is a collaboration with Level Ground Studios, which is an LA-based American production studio, which is our attempt to shape a massive narrative intervention in Canada. The Trump tariff threat really means that the rhetorical space in this country is open in a way that it hasn't been in decades. And what we want to do with this project is sort of tap into this growing anti-American sentiment by telling the real true story about the history of the Canadian economy over the past 50 years, in which we have been the victims of this sort of conspiracy to turn our country into a colony of the United States through forced deindustrialization and the free trade and all kinds of things. And this is not a film about climate change at all. We're trying to just operate on the level of attacking the core myths that underlie extractive populism and point towards an alternate perspective that is more based in sort of a working class analysis, coming out on Canada Day 2026. Thank you, everyone.
So there's a lot to unpack there for sure. Wow. Are there some questions from the floor? We do have to keep these sessions tight because we have one more to go, and we have an armchair discussion with Brazil to cap us off. But are there some questions from the floor or from any of the other rooms? Yes. Yeah, please.
So much amazing work, Gareth, and Ruby. I'm wondering, what does I really liked the megaphone visualization, and we do know that there has, at least like in my experience, I think in a lot of the experience of a lot of people around here, we tend to kind of be like, oh, how do we defend against what's coming out of that megaphone? But have you and your team thought a little bit about like what our megaphone looks like in trying to build an alternate narrative as opposed to a defensive narrative? Have you done any thinking about that? Like, is that something that
yeah, a little bit. I think our goal with the rollout of this film project is really to do a kind of pilot example of like what would a nationwide strategic comms strategy look like with trying to engage as many partners as possible and do the kinds of things that we see when there are strategic coordinated campaigns on the other side, right? And so we're thinking a lot about the distribution strategy there, but we're also in the process of, working to develop, networks of partners across the country that are like progressive organizers and people that for whom we can develop relationships to really think about like taking on this right-wing infosphere and how do we think about it proactively rather than reactively. And, you know about that. So we, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Gareth. That felt like a blast from the past, in the best sense of the word. You're an economic nationalist, and the left has given up on economic nationalist messaging in Canada for too long. Sean Devlin has just made a film called Asog, which is he spent a number of years in the Philippines, and he's telling the stories through actual people who survived the typhoon Yolanda, I think. And it's a film that is deeply rooted in a similar kind of spirit as what you're doing here with How to Buy a Country. And if you're looking for allies and people, Sean Devlin. Do you know Sean?
I think I've seen an email chain with him.
You've seen Sean,
Yeah,
definitely. I mean,
definitely.
people in this room, I bet you, I'm not the only person here, but he's the one who stood up behind Harper with Stop Harper signs at a demo in Vancouver 15 years ago.
Thank you. That's a really good reminder. I had that in the back of my head to reach out.
He's very in your face and he's very plucky.
Excellent. That's what we need. Yeah.
Thank you again so much for that presentation. We look forward to the movie Canada Day next year. So sticking with the theme of democracy, we've also talked quite a bit about the importance of local action. And so our final presentation for this panel is going to be with Megan Lohmann, CEO of Community Energy Association, along with Zoe Grams from Climate Caucus. And they're going to talk about a cross-Canada initiative and collaboration of non-profit supporting local governments on climate action.
I'm going to jump right in. Okay. Thank you. We're going to ask you to scan this QR code because the premise of our presentation is that community activation and engagement is critical to change. So we are going to activate and engage with you. So please get into the Menti. You can also use menti.com and the code. Where did Zoe go? There you are. Okay, it'll be available. Oh, no, it's not there. Okay. Thanks, everyone. I know that we're nearing the end of the day and it's been a very, okay. I'll leave it up for a couple seconds for sure. I'm going to start my timer as well. Really appreciate all of the expertise, insights of everyone in the room yesterday and today. We're bringing it way down to ground level now, way down. And if you wondered why climate action at the local level is hard, all of what you said and what we're going to present to you. So we're presenting on behalf of a collaboration of 5 organizations that operate across Canada, working with municipalities, Indigenous communities, local governments, regional districts to plan and implement climate and energy plans and implementation. We have been working together for about 2.5 years. Can I go forward now? Yeah. With the support of a number of foundations that have been
so generous in enabling us the time and space to have a hard look in the mirror and consider how and why climate action is not happening to the degree that we need it to at the community level. So obviously a huge thank you to all the funders that have supported this work and to the co-designers that have been along this journey with us for the past 2.5 years. Why we do the work is because 50% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are directly or indirectly influenced by municipalities. We also know that municipalities care. Many of them are actually mandated in some provinces to have climate action plans, but at the end of the day, 63% of municipalities actually have plans. Over 650 have declared climate emergencies, yet we are seeing about 16% of municipalities that have achieved any sort of meaningful action on climate change. So despite the intention, despite often policy, and despite reiteration after reiteration of their climate action plans, we're not moving the dial. Our 5 organizations, frankly, have perpetuated the cycle of, okay, you need to refresh your plan, do your inventory, here's your list of 80 things that you have to do, go do it. And so we wanted to disrupt this cycle and determine a more impactful way forward. The reason we're at the conference is obviously, you can probably guess some of the factors that have led to this lack of implementation. So we're going to turn it.
Okay, so what we're talking about, a big part of it is community engagement and democracy. So we're going to ask for your engagement now, which is why you have that Menti QR code. So we're asking all of you to think of yourselves as climate planners. You are in charge of developing a community climate plan for your municipality. You got $100,000 to do it, and we want to make sure that it's achievable, it's actionable, it's ambitious, and also that it's going to land well when you finally launch it. And there's 4 things that you can spend your money on. You can spend it on technical analysis, so looking at what our current energy inventory is, looking at energy modeling, costing things out. You can spend it on community engagement, asking what businesses need, asking what the community feeling is about current practices and where the community could go. Plan writing and documentation, making sure that you've got drafting, approvals, any beautiful infographics that you need to have happen. And then finally, thinking through and planning for implementation and capacity building. So $100,000, if everybody wants to go to their Menti, and in a minute or so, divide up what you think your budget should be spent on out of those 4 things. Achievable, ambitious, and landing. Let's see what everyone's thinking. If we go to the, oh, okay. Interesting, okay. So we've got implementation and capacity building. So really a good portion of folks thinking about how we're going to look ahead. So that once we've got this piece of paper, what are we actually going to do with it? Interesting. That's the highest, followed by community and engagement and trust building, then technical analyses and plan writing. So the vast majority is around how we're going to land this and how we're going to land this with the community. Brilliant. Now let's look at what actually happens in municipal climate plans. Can you guess? There might be a difference. We are, yes, thank you. So here's what the reality is like currently. Well, maybe I'll start. Yeah, okay. So this is what most climate action budgets are like. Half of it is on technical analysis, 25% is on the drafting, the redrafting, the infographics, 10% on implementation, and just 15% on engagement. But it gets worse. So, and here's the thing, and to Megan's point, I mean, our organizations have built climate plans. We recognize we're part of the problem. And what we're talking about is not because of a lack of goodwill. It's not because of a lack of ambition. And it's not because of a lack of technical knowledge. It's because there are structural problems in how we're thinking about climate planning. And this is what we're trying to solve for together. So if you can believe it, 30% of municipalities did not do any engagement when they built a climate plan. Of those that did, only half engaged with any businesses, and only 1 to 3% of the community was consulted. And then if you want to go into some of the details here, on average, 48% of stakeholders were not engaged in a climate planning process. And if you look here, you can barely see it. This is municipalities reporting themselves. Only 3% of stakeholders that were engaged were actually empowered. And that's experts in energy emissions and management, certain organizations, and energy service providers. Perhaps, shamefully, but perhaps unsurprisingly, the marginalized and underrepresented communities are the least consulted and the least represented, and there's no sense of empowerment anywhere on that list. So it's a huge problem, and you can start to see why we're thinking about how this may contribute to trust and mis and disinformation and a sense of building out community buy-in when it comes to climate politics at a local scale. And the next step, and we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to keep this very brief, is just given this factor, we have a second question on Mentee, and we won't review it, but just have a think about what your reaction would be in your community if given that level of participation, you then see a climate plan being handed to you and being enacted. What are some of the one-liners that you might come up with? What are some of the feelings that you might have when you see this climate plan in action?
Maybe we'll flip it up at the end, but we will proceed here. And just for sense of scale, like I looked at one of the more expensive climate action plan breakdowns in LA. It's like over $4 million was spent on their climate mitigation resilience plan. 1.5 million of that was just in the technical data compilation. And I think it was like $220,000 on engagement, like on a $4 million budget. I'm just going to flip through here. Okay, so what we're proposing is actually to flip the script. So we spend so much effort, money, energy on the foundational pieces of the planning, the inventory being the big one. That costs a lot. It takes a long time. If we're going to meaningfully identify the partners in the community that can help us implement, that requires scanning planning documents, strategies, et cetera, of other organizations. It's months of time, leaving us little time and money or local government's capacity to activate the community. What we have developed and what we're doing sort of micro pilots on while we engage with foundations for additional funding to actually implement this is leveraging AI in a good way. I was very scared yesterday, but leveraging the good parts of AI to accelerate the technical inventory process. So we don't have to spend 6 months scouring data, putting it through spreadsheets. We can get to the breakdown of emissions in a community much quicker. We can also leverage AI and computing power to find the alignments of values in the community to engage the organizations that are going to be our implementation partners right from the outset. So what we're doing is we're looking for aligned values. It could be, the quick example, maybe a social housing or the Home Builders Association in a community. Likely in their plan, strategy, ambitions for the, for their organization, they've got energy poverty, or they've got market transformation, economic development, or they've got upskilling of trades. Let's use those aligned values to do a retrofit project. You get a win of the goals that you've set as an organization, and we can progress that retrofit initiative much quicker. They're engaged at the start of the process because we've been able to spend less time and money on the technical side and accelerate the process through to the community activation. It's a, this is a proposal at this point, but we're trying, as I said, to embed, as we're practicing day to day right now, that meaningful upfront engagement and alignment of values in order to have a co-designed outcome. What we found through the 2.5 years of research, obviously, is that everything that's wrong with the planning process is leading to polarization, misinformation, to siloed work, to lack of implementation, to exhausted staff, council members, and a community that is losing trust. They're showing up at council meetings, being very threatening and disruptive around these types of processes when they're not involved. Contributing to this, of course, are a number of other socially related challenges. Oh, okay, we'll just wrap up. So we feel that our approach is going to allow us to access and present fairer and smarter data, that we're going to have collective community energy planning, that is going to be a realistic and very tailored, focused action plan, no more 80-point plans, instead a handful of initiatives that reflect the values and important work that organizations and communities are already doing. When we've tested this with the communities, this is the type of feedback we're getting, that they're feeling for the first time hopeful that we can start to shift the system itself instead of forcing local governments to keep struggling within these constraints. I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. That's great. That's great work. Thank you so much for sharing it. And it's amazing how often, as we've been discussing approaches to democracy and democratization over the past few days, that the alignment of values comes up, and of course the importance of consultations, that people feel more apt to criticize or to feel marginalized when they haven't been meaningfully consulted, rather than consulted as a check mark. So thank you for sharing your observations on all that. We can only take a couple of really quick questions because we need to pivot quickly. Yes.
Thanks very much. So my firm, SSG, or Sustainability Solutions Group, has done most of the climate action plans in Canada. And so I agree with your analysis, and I focus on the engagement now as a climate planner. I've been doing it for 20 years. One thing, resource MEED, we started MEED, MEED. We have done all of the inventories for all municipalities in Canada for free, so anybody can access them there to get out of that problem, because we recognize that too. It shouldn't stop effective climate action. And then just to say, Zoe, I'd love to connect with you more on some of the solutions end of things, because also when folks show up to municipal councils, it's also because climate planning is multi-decadal, as soon as they don't see a reduction in emissions for these structural problems, the community starts to fight the plan to begin with, even if they were meaningfully consulted. So I'd love to talk with you more about that. Thank you.
Great new partnerships are being developed at the summit. So anyway, thank you very much again. Great work. And we look forward to hearing more about your studies, and ideally making accessible that second question you had would be helpful too.